Welcome to part 1 of sewing hidden pockets onto woven fabric. The seam allowance for this pattern is 5/8 inch, but you can easily adjust it to 1/2 inch or even 1/4 inch. Use the same seam allowance on the outer edge of the pocket pattern as well. You'll be cutting 4 total, so 2 pieces for each side. Because I'm using woven fabric, which means it doesn't stretch, you can use the tearaway method, which will straighten the grain. Before cutting both pairs of pocket pieces out, make sure that the fabric's wrong sides are facing each other. I made this hidden pocket pattern pretty versatile, so you can shorten the length if needed. You can snip a small notch around 2 to 3 inches from your natural waistline, and this is where you'll be placing the top of your pocket piece, and you want to make sure that right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Before you sew the pocket piece onto the fabric, I highly recommend basting. All you have to do is make sure that you baste the same seam allowance for the entire pocket piece before attaching it to the side seam. Now, basting beforehand isn't a necessary step, but I do find it helpful later on because you can use it as a guideline when you're sewing the side seams together. With right sides of the fabric matching each other, line up both side seams of the pocket to the fabric. After you've pinned these pieces together, now you're ready to sew a straight line down the side seam using the same seam allowance, which in this case it's 5/8 inch. Repeat this step for all 4 pocket pieces. And the next step is optional, but I do find that pressing the seams open and flat is very helpful, especially when sewing with wovens. With right sides facing each other, pin along the outer edge of the side seam. Take your time during this step to make sure everything is lining up perfectly. It should look like the pocket is inside out. I like adding extra pins in the actual opening of the pocket between the top and the bottom of the pocket side seam. And this is the best time to check the underside to make sure both layers are pinned together and they're matching up. And now we're going to sew along the outer edge of the side seam. And now you'll see why that basting stitch was really helpful along the outside of the pocket piece. This way, when you pivot at the top of the pocket piece, you'll have the exact seam allowance correct. Take your time sewing around the curve of the actual pocket piece. Again, you can use the basting stitch as your guideline. When you get to the bottom of the pocket opening, you're going to continue sewing straight until your needle hits the actual side seam. Then you'll pivot and then continue sewing down the side seam. So if you make it a habit to add the basting stitches, this will make sewing pockets 10 times easier for you. Now this next step is optional, but I think it adds a nice professional touch. I add it to my own handmade orders. Just add a top stitching to the actual side seam, and you can stop at the top of the pattern and the bottom of the pattern. The top stitch will be a nice reinforcement to the side seam to make sure that the pocket lays flat as well. And this is how easy it is to sew your own hidden pockets into your apparel. I have the dollar digital pattern linked below, and in part 2 I show you how to sew hidden pockets with stretch knit fabrics.